Hello. We are doing something different this time. This is the first writing workshop. So for this, what I'd like you to do is have out a piece of paper or maybe another Word document on your computer opened up. And what we're going to do is take time to actually create elements of your paper. The first thing is your individual proposal that you have to turn in that has major structure to it. The prospectus before that is only a page, idea statement talking about your variables, maybe talking about some of the research you found, but the literature review and the major elements that you'll create for the individual proposal is what we'll be talking about today, the introduction and lit review. After that, you do the methods, results, and discussions, and that's all the major sections of your paper that you turn in at the end of the semester. But the first thing you do is your lit review, right? And that's where you literally discuss the different concepts and research behind those concepts that you'll be studying in your particular investigation, right? So when you start any research paper or research project, it really should say, when you're starting fresh, you want to investigate some sort of new variable. You have to identify that sort of literature base in some way, right? You can start with sort of a problem area, something that's like sort of maybe practically problematic, like learning difficulties or let's say aggression in relationships. Or you can choose a body of literature, and what's kind of unique about that is it can span disciplines, right? Like there can be medical, philosophical, societal sort of writings, like social psych sort of stuff, or maybe even clinical psych, all dealing with the same topic, right? And there could be theories involved in that, right? Sort of, let's say, social exchange theory or theories of aggression, evolutionary theories. So there could be different theories you want to discuss, no matter how you're structuring this paper, right? So these are sort of all elements you could get together to sort of get at these variables or concepts you want to discuss. So the main thing is identifying these key variables and the terminology that you have to sort of use to describe it, and maybe sometimes distinguish it from other related concepts, right? So you'll get a lot of different sorts of research. And to evaluate that, remember that the source is the first thing you need to consider. You need to mostly use research articles, empirical articles, and mostly journal articles you'll be looking at will be also citing empirical articles. So stick to those mostly. Some edited scholarly books, and then some society web pages, like let's say the American Cancer Association might have some good stats for you. You also want to look at the sample, right? Most of the time we want to use like human subjects sort of research, and if they have a sample, that's a step in the right direction. Sometimes there's theoretical stuff that's maybe not as useful in talking about the state of the field or what's going on right now. The methodology is something that you may not be as familiar with yet. We haven't even got to it in this class, but things like surveys versus experiments are important to note. Longitudinal types of studies or very large sample sizes are important to note. Measurement devices now are important in that you're collecting them maybe for your own studies. So see what they're using to measure these different concepts, and then see if they're doing it in a quantitative or qualitative sort of sense. Qualitative being the more narrative, thought-based sort of questions. Quantitative being scales, right? Like 1 to 10, 1 to 30 measurement scales that you can sort of reuse most of the time. So you want to grab those if you see them, get those sites. As a new sort of writer and as a new person to a field, one thing you have to do is sort of put this all together in some sort of way and organize it. So you can organize pro versus con, different theories that sort of come up, different sort of results that people find, support or not support, let's say, for those theories. And then, sort of actually organize it to do your writing. And when I say putting it together, I think more for the writing or generation portion of this. You can have sort of piles of interest, like let's say, social exchange theory sort of articles and examples of that. Maybe depression articles versus, let's say, social media articles if you're doing something with depression and social media. And then you can, maybe even put that information for each article on note cards or create outlines with that. I like note cards because you can put the citation on one side and put some facts that you learned from the article on the other. If you do that, there's no way you could ever plagiarize, so that's nice. And outlines really help you organize your thoughts, so sort of structure, what things you'll discuss when. Once you finish writing, it's a good idea to actually outline what you did, and then think about, okay, is that the story I want to tell? And then maybe re-outline what you did. Anyway, so there's two major parts to the lit review. There's the introduction and the lit review, and some people don't distinguish this, but the introduction to the lit review is sort of more general, and it should include the sort of area of interest along with why it's important. So this is where stats come in, grab the reader's attention. 20% of people report being lonely at work or something like that. That's not very earth-shattering sounding. Let's say it's 50% or something. That would be a better stat to use. Anyways, it should sort of lead the reader, whoever's digesting this, to some sort of idea that you have, right? That maybe like isolation is bad or good, and maybe some sort of study idea that you may have that you're hinting at there. So it's not really, in-depth as like previous research as the lit review, and definitely not offering your hypotheses just yet, probably, right? This is separate from the lit review, but not always distinct. So it might just be the first paragraph or two. But you'll notice these. The more articles you'll look at, the more you'll notice these pop out at you. Usually it's just defining the variables, talking about them in more broad terms. Again, less specific to research findings and studies. They don't usually describe those at the early part. So what I want you to do is maybe pause here and try to write your first sentence of the paper. So think about what you would say to really grab the reader's attention right off the bat. What would that be? Go ahead and pause if you want and do that. I'm going to assume you did pause. Maybe you did not. I don't know. But I hope that you sort of think about how you would want to grab the reader's attention, introduce that first major variable. And this intro parallels the lit review. So whatever you talk about first here, you'll talk about in the lit review first. So think about whatever variable is more interesting maybe, or you're more likely to find that interesting statistic about. Now also think about what else you would want to say in that. So what else should you mention at this stage? Maybe your other most important variable, maybe something about whether it's good or bad outcomes that stem from this sort of relationship or concept. What else would you want to put, in other words? Maybe think about a couple other things. Pause the recording again if you'd like to do that. And think about anything else you'd like to add into that sort of opening up or first stage. The end of the intro sometimes, and if not the intro, the lit review ends with a current study sort of sum up, but sometimes the intro itself has a little roadmap too, where it sort of leads the reader what else they're going to talk about through the rest of the lit review. So, in some way throughout that little intro, the major variables are somehow introduced, right? And typically, hinting at sort of either collecting data or testing hypotheses or testing some proposition by combining previous research and looking at the field in more of a theoretical way, or, thinking about what's been done versus creating new knowledge. The literature review is the other major part of this. So this is where you talk about all the research, that's been done, hopefully not in what we call an annotated bibliography form, which is just sort of one study right after another, description, description, description. You really want to weave these together, talk about the concepts, talk about the variables and the different methodologies used in results, but look for commonalities. Think of trends or themes that are coming up. Use quotations very sparingly, I say there. I say one quote per paper. Don't go more than that. I want to read your writing, not the writing of others at this stage, so just go with one quote per paper max. But as you're doing that, point to trends, look for gaps in the knowledge, and hopefully there'll be something that's, under-researched, or some sort of maybe a gender question that is unanswered, right, that you can sort of contribute to. That's the really goal here, right, is to move science forward, remember. So think about what else you would want to mention in this larger lit review. Remember, this is more detailed. So if you're talking about, let's say, depression and social media, within social media, maybe at the beginning in the intro, you just talk about how many people use social media. But in the lit review, you want to talk about different studies and sort of the outcomes of social media use. Maybe that'll be a section. The precursors to social media use, or what leads people to use it, might be a subsection. So there might be more detail for just social media. Same thing with depression, right? Types of depression, outcomes of depression, precursors to depression, maybe. And then after you talk about all this, you'll weave it together somehow, hopefully. But remember, you talk about depression, then you talk about social media, then you talk about social media and depression, right? You don't talk about them all at the same time. So you can pause and outline if you haven't already through all my rambling, but think about what else you might want in that larger lit review. Finally, some considerations you might have are, what theories did you discuss? Do you think that adequately explains it? Is there some other theory you need to introduce? If you did introduce that theory, did you adequately describe it and any other related concepts that you're distinguishing it from? I think that's important, and especially to back it up with some sort of previous findings, research related to that, right? Anyways, what other variables did you introduce? Did you introduce too many variables? Is one major question. If you don't really have a hypothesis about a variable, if you don't plan to, you have to really make sure you're talking about it for a reason. And anything you do speak to, let's say depression, think about it conceptually, discuss it conceptually as well as operationally. So how do they measure this? How do they observe it? How do they capture it in some empirical sense, right? And make sure, of course, you have citations for each variable you discuss, each theory you bring up. All those studies you talk about, they should each have a citation in the references, right? And nothing extra. The current study and predictions usually happens at the end of the lit review. You'll find this, sometimes it's called a hypothesis section, whatever. It's some sort of sum up, integration sometimes, a final wrap up, put a bow on the whole sort of concept there in some way, right? Sometimes they also hint towards like, this is really what we're adding, or this is what we're contributing in this study, current study section. But you also have those predictions, right? So make sure at the end of this lit review that you do have at least one testable prediction, right? Higher levels of X will relate to lower levels of Y, or individuals who are exposed to X will have higher feelings of Y, right? So these are specific sort of statements. They include each of those variables, right? What direction they're going, and the sort of relationship between them, right? So it's they're specific, they include the variables, both of them, and they have some sort of prediction going in one way or another. Those are the sort of three key elements of them. So think about that for a second. What sort of predictions would you want? Would you want a couple different predictions? Maybe you have 2 or 3 variables. Hopefully not 4 or 5. That might be too many. But whatever variables you have, you typically have some relationship formulated. Not necessarily between every single variable, maybe between depression and social media use, and depression and some other sort of, let's say, behavior, maybe socializing in general, some other sort of outcome. So you could have one IV and a couple of DVs, or vice versa. But what would those predictions be? Think about that. Alright, now if you are thinking about those 3rd and 4th and 5th variables, some of you, that's right, you may have one variable that you're kind of thinking about. Maybe not that, but hopefully at least one variable. You may be just coming onto that 2nd variable, so maybe you're thinking about social media. Maybe you're trying to think about what that other variable would be. If you have a 3rd variable, say you're thinking about social media, you want to look at depression, maybe you also want to look at anxiety or something like that, slightly different from the depression variable. These are maybe what we call intervening variables. They could be moderators or mediators, but they're variables that sort of affect the relationship that we see, that major sort of IVDV, if you want to call it that. So a moderator increases or decreases the outcome, we say. So it's sort of an exacerbator. It could make situations worse, let's say. So in a situation, if you're looking at exposure to community violence leading to violent behavior, let's say in schools, anxiety would be a moderator if it changes the expression of violent behavior based on their exposure to community violence. So it's sort of multiplicative in a sense. And that's statistically how we actually look at that exposure to community violence times their anxiety. So high levels of ECV, high levels of anxiety cause the worst, let's say, violent behavior, right? But there's some sort of interaction there between those. Mediators are more about the sort of floodgate, I say, or the expression of the outcome, to where the mediator dictates whether that outcome stems from that original IV, in this case, exposure to community violence. So let's say anger is a mediator. This ECV variable leads to anger, anger leads to violent behavior. If anger doesn't happen, violent behavior doesn't happen. So it's sort of integral in the process, or it mediates that relationship. There's partial and full mediation, don't worry about that, but it's saying that, exposure to community violence, higher levels of that, and lead to higher levels of anger, let's say, and then higher levels of anger lead to higher levels of violent behavior. But if exposure to community violence doesn't lead to anger, then anger, let's say, does not produce violent behavior. So that's more of a floodgate, or the mechanism through which it flows. Anyways, different types of variables that you may be thinking of, including, but don't feel obligated to do that. These third variables could be modeled in some way, though. So if you have those, remember you have to have extra hypotheses for those too. So think about how to phrase that. And of course, to have that perfect, I will let you slip on those. But trying is important to then introduce it for the group project. So if you have any questions about moderators and mediators, feel free to email me too, and I can help you with that.